Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this next rendition of the Sports Psych Concepts lecture series. Today, got some interesting things to go over. We're going to talk about how to optimize learning, right? And how do we do that within the context of proper practice and feedback? So those of you who are coaches out there, this will benefit you a lot, but even sports psych consultants, this can be useful because we work with coaches. It's a primary population who we work with, and we can help them fine-tune some of the things that they're doing in their practices. I'll never forget a college basketball coach that I consulted once, where I shared some of these ideas with him, and it kind of blew his mind because it was just like that awareness. Whoa, had a blind spot, didn't realize that. That's just kind of always the way that I've done things. And wow, I guess I'm grateful that he was open to it. Grateful to have that pointed out to me. So a couple of things we're going to go over in this presentation. What the basics of learning, like what does that mean? Learning, how can we define that, and how it applies to athletes? What are the key elements of optimal practice design? How do we design a practice? How do we put that together? A lot of coaches don't really have any training in that at all. It's just kind of thrown together the way their coach put together a practice for them. And then we'll touch on this idea of deliberate practice. Okay, it's something that is really important to understand. It gets thrown out there a little bit because it's important. And if you haven't heard of it, want to make sure that we touch on that. Then we'll end with some error detection ideas on how to go about that, and then how to provide feedback when we see those things. Now, it's important to mention this up front. There's so much depth in these things that I'm just going to gloss over. So if you have more interest in some of these ideas, just recognize that I'm not going to go into the level of detail that is possible with these. So I encourage you to do a little deeper dive on your own outside of this presentation. So with that, let's keep moving forward into this stuff. So the first question we have to ask ourselves here as practitioners in the sporting world is, how do we know when our athletes have actually learned something? Like, what's our gauge? How do we measure that? Can we do that objectively, or is it some sort of subjective thing? And there's a famous quote from the legendary coach John Wooden, who said, well, you haven't taught until they have learned. And that's kind of an interesting, well, yeah, I coach athletes. Well, like, are they actually learning? Are they actually improving? You're out there coaching. You haven't coached until they've seen that improvement. You haven't taught until they've learned. So that's kind of a nice idea. So most of us think of the outcome when we look at this idea. Like, well, okay, this tennis player, they couldn't hit a serve before, but now they can hit a serve, right? And so that outcome itself is almost too simplistic. It's like cut and dry. Like, well, is just the outcome itself the measurement, or is there more to it than that? And of course there is, because learning is a process, right? And so it has three primary components. So the first is the process itself, and how can we measure that? So we're looking at progress. So maybe a tennis player, they can't hit, when they started, they couldn't hit a serve in the box. No, not at all. Now, maybe they still can't hit it in the box, but they at least have a consistent ball toss and a more consistent swing path. Maybe they're using the right grip that we're trying to teach them to use. So there's some progression that we can track. So we would say in that instance, well, yes, learning has occurred. It is occurring. They cannot complete the outcome yet, but they are progressing. And a lot of times athletes themselves struggle with this idea. And I've worked with athletes myself where I say, like, hey, yeah, we're moving in the right direction. Like, well, yeah, but I still can't do it. I still didn't get it done. Like there's this fixation on the outcomes. Like, hey, you got to give yourself some credit. You're moving in that direction, right? There's distance between you and the target, and the only way you get to the target is by closing the distance, moving in that direction. So we need to, as consultants and practitioners, understand that this progression, it happens over time, and we want to see some improvement over time, and that's a way that we can measure whether learning has actually occurred. So there's the process is one component. The next component is whether there's actually a change. Okay, and this ties into making progress. Well, is there a change? Is there something measurable? And it doesn't always just have to be related to the behavior. So it can be related to their attitude about it, their knowledge or their understanding, and then the actual movement pattern or the behavior itself. So these things can be influential. So the example here is the knowledge, and I've heard athletes say this, well, I know how to do it. I just can't do it yet. I can see it in my mind. I understand what you're saying, coach. I just can't do it yet. So that's a sign of learning, right? They're understanding more of the mechanics. It's just whether they can execute that. So we need to recognize those pieces. So you have the process, you have the change, and then the last primary component is their experience. So this is bringing in the unique individual features of the person or the athlete who you're working with. Okay, so their experiences, their starting point's going to be different. How they experience your coaching and the process and the change is going to be unique. And so we have to acknowledge those pieces as they come along. We don't want to pigeonhole them and just compare them to everybody else. Okay, so with those things, we can kind of define learning as we can say that it's occurred when there's some sort of relatively permanent change that happens. Okay, you hear the expression get thrown around all the time, like, well, practice makes perfect. It's like, no, well, perfect practice makes perfect. Well, not really. It's perfect practice makes permanent, right? So that permanent thing, learning has occurred when something becomes relatively permanent. Okay, it's just repeatable. It can happen, and I always kind of am amazed at this process myself. As grew up playing lots of different sports, don't always go out and practice the sports at the same level that I used to, but I can go out to the basketball court, someone hand me a basketball, I can dribble that ball. I can do all the ball handling stuff. I can shoot it. I can knock it down. Like, wow, that's just amazing. It really is permanent. So yeah, like maybe there can be this whole knock the rust off idea because you don't have that feel that you used to have. But I mean, you wrap enough myelin around those neurons, right? You get that thick sheath there, man, those motor patterns will come right back to you. Okay, so that's important to understand because we can't directly observe learning, right? We're making inferences on what we're observing about their behavior or their performance. Okay, so now last thing here on this idea, we need to acknowledge that it is possible for an athlete to have actually learned a skill, like they've learned it, they understand it, but then they still perform it incorrectly because sport is dynamic. It's this open environment where all of these different things can happen. So it's like, well, yeah, you've learned that skill. I see you do it in practice, but then somehow it didn't come out in the game, in the competition. What happened? Right. And so that's where it's a reinforcement for that idea that we want our practice and competition environment to be as identical as possible. We want those to be really similar so there's a lot of transfer and crossover. So it's not, oh, we have these great practice players in this closed environment where we control everything and they can do it all there, but then in competition it's not there anymore because we didn't account for that. Okay, so those are some key ideas on learning to set the tone for the rest of this presentation as we move forward. Now let's take a look at something that I consider to be the key to all learning, right? And that is essentially we need to find out what they already know. And then once we know what prior knowledge they're bringing into the situation, we can link what they know to what we're trying to teach them, right? Or we have some idea, some skill that we want to teach them that's new to them. if we want to accelerate that learning process, we need to connect that new skill with something that they already know. Okay, so they don't come in as blank slates. They know things already, and we have to figure out how to activate that, to connect that or scaffold that onto, or to add the new knowledge that we want them to gain. So, for example, here, I tend to give a lot of tennis examples because of my background in there. But if I'm teaching an overhead smash in tennis, one of the first things that you do is you drop back. Okay, so that ball is going to, you're up at the net in tennis, that ball goes up like they're trying to lob it over your head and get the ball to land behind you. You drop back, and basically it's like this quarterback drop back. You're facing the net, then you turn, that racket's up in the air, you lift that left shoulder, and you take a few steps back, like you're dropping back like a quarterback in football. So a lot of athletes can go, oh, it's like a drop back quarterback. Okay, I get that, right? Or if they're learning how to toss the ball, maybe cooperatively with each other in tennis or in some other sport, you're teaching kids how to toss underhand. You don't want it to be this crazy, their arms flailing all over the place as they're tossing the ball. So pretend that you're holding the butterfly in your hand and you want to let that butterfly go. Nice and easy, right? So you're holding on to that gentle like, and then you're going to lift that hand up in the air and let it go. Okay, so you build this powerful imagery in their mind. Okay, so the last one that I'll share with you that I think is, because there's all sorts of good ones, but how to teach the toss for a serve in tennis. I love this one. So sometimes the toss can be really wonky for players if they don't know how to, well, I got to coordinate my non-dominant hand to toss the ball, and then my racket hand's doing something. How am I supposed to do that? And so the ball can just be flying all over the place. Really not great for having a consistent tennis serve. So I had little kids, I do this sometimes. Well, have them hold their hand out, like, pretend like you're holding an ice cream cone. Hold your hand out like you're holding an ice cream cone. Then I take the ball over, which is, of course, the ice cream, and set that on their hand. And say, okay, now you're going to try and toss that ice cream straight up in the air and see if you can get it to come back on that ice cream cone. I'll never forget this little kid, like, well, why would I want to toss my ice cream up in the air? Why would I just befuddled? Why would I ever suggest such a crazy thing like that? Okay, but using things, analogies or visuals like that, they can be powerful. The imagery to connect with something that they already know, they understand, connect that with what it is that you're wanting them to use. So all sorts of different ideas there. Okay, so you can tell stories, you can use metaphors, different analogies. There's all sorts of examples out there. So another one, I'll have athletes pretend like they're taking their racket back through water. Is the technique on a tennis serve. Again, is that tossing arm is going to go up first, and the racket arm kind of lags behind it. They don't go up together. And so you can imagine you're pulling that racket back through water underneath you, but then that other hand is above the water. You're standing in the pool waist deep, for example, right? You share images like that. That can be super helpful. So come up with those in your own sporting context to use to help activate that prior knowledge. But also, we need to be aware of a faulty prior knowledge, right? So you'll have some athletes that'll bring in some ideas that are real head scratchers. So the example here that I go back to is like you have some misconceptions that get in the way. So I have the primary example is related to running, okay, running mechanics. So when we're kids, most of the time, a coach, a parent, whoever, just go run. You just go run, right? And it's just assumed that, well, we know how to run. We can coordinate that. And so you see kids running with their arms all over the place. You're like, whoa, man, that looks a little crazy. Get those arms in. What are you doing? Get those knees up. Keep it down. Keep it underneath you. There's all these different elements to running. And it's like we're never taught how to do that. And so you can have some athletes come in that they have this prior knowledge of, well, my coach showed me how to do this and this is how I'm supposed to run. It's like, well, you're a sprinter. You don't want to run like a distance runner, and a distance runner, you don't want to run like a sprinter. Like, the mechanics are different. So we need to understand, well, you're coming in with some knowledge that may not actually be fit with what it is that is optimal or desirable. Distance runners and mileage is another example there. Like, well, okay, it's like just the more miles, the better, right? Like, well, I mean, that's mostly going to be true to a certain point, but then the law of diminishing returns comes in and slaps you in the face with all these injuries. So we have to recognize what is it they're coming in with, where does that knowledge come from, how does that jive with what it is we're trying to teach them, right? And link those things up as best we can to help them succeed. Okay, so now let's dig a little bit deeper into this idea of learning. So there's some different philosophies out there, but one of the primary conceptual models that we use to look at learning and track how it occurs are these three learning phases. Okay, so you have the cognitive stage or phase, the associative phase, and the autonomous phase. Now they're all not distinct phases. It's more like a continuum depending on the skill that we're talking about, right? So the phase may vary by the particular skill in a sport. So for example, if I'm a basketball player, I could be at a different stage for my dribbling skill versus my shooting skill, just based on where I'm at on the learning continuum. Okay, so it can vary, and it isn't necessarily just always in one direction. Sometimes you have it can be cyclical, like athletes go through this, they get to where it's an automatic or autonomous. They aren't really thinking about it. It's just happening. They're refining the movements, and then all of a sudden something comes up, and they go back and they think back. They start thinking more about what it is they're doing. So there's some cool sports psych concepts that can be tied into this related to choking, for example, right? Oh, you can have these professional athletes and they choke. Like, what happened? They looked so fluid and smooth. Everything was automatic. And then they got in this hairy, high pressure situation, and everything became disjointed and robotic and rigid and not smooth at all. And like, what happened, right? They started thinking more about what it was they're doing, and so then they lost that sort of automaticity that they had before. Okay, so the three stages. Cognitive is the first one. So this is when someone's first learning a movement, learning a skill, they're thinking their way through it. It's more cognitive. They're trying to understand it. So there tend to be a lot of mistakes with this, inconsistent performance. The movement is deliberate, it's uncoordinated. Athletes don't like being in this stage that much, especially athletes who have a more established motor pattern. So I work a lot with senior master levels athletes, and anytime I introduce a sort of a new idea for them, or I want to sort of retool or repackage the skill set that they have, they kind of give me the eye, the look, right? Like, I don't know if I really want to go through that. And so I always point this out very, very transparently. Like, look, we got to go through some cognitive work here. We need to think our way through this, and then we're going to move on to feeling our way through this, right? So the wheels have to be turning a little bit when we're trying to learn something new. That's the first part. We need to understand it that way. This stage usually doesn't last all that long, okay? But the role of the coach here is to focus really on the most critical parts of the skill, because you can get bogged down in this. Coaches, they have a lot of knowledge, technical knowledge. Like, man, I could break down this movement and talk about the biomechanics and the joint angles and all of the things that have to happen for this for this skill to be executed properly. But athletes can't process all that and then do the skill. So we have to focus on the most critical parts of the skill. And during this stage, we want to rely actually more on demonstration than excessive verbal instruction. So I'm sure some of you are all thinking like, oh man, I had that coach just like talk too much, right? And it's often better. Think about how kids learn how to do something. It's monkey see, monkey do. That needs to be our dominant approach when they're in the cognitive stage. Like, hey, I'm going to explain this to you. So we're going to have the verbal instruction focused on the critical elements, and I want you to watch me, get this image in your mind of what we want to do. Okay, so once they understand those basic elements of the skill and what it should look like, then they'll move beyond that phase pretty quickly, like I said, and we move to the associative stage. Okay, so cognitive stage, associative stage here, the emphasis is on refining the skill. So we have much more accurate and consistent performance when we get to this phase. It appears usually more coordinated. We can complete it with more speed, right? You can add more game speed to the movement, right? And this is what I was hinting at before, is we shift from more of a visual or sort of cognitive sensation to it to more of a feeling, right? I can feel my way through the movement because I understand more of what it's supposed to feel like. So I've had so many aha moments with athletes when I get them into this stage. Like I explain it to them, they're trying to watch me, and I'm just not really feeling what it is you're talking about. And sometimes I'll guide their body through the motion, and then I'll just go, oh wow, like that's way different than what I thought, right? Or they'll say, no, that just feels weird. It just feels weird. I was like, yeah, it feels different because you're actually doing it the way you want to do it, right? In your mind, you're in the cognitive stage and you're thinking, oh, well, it should feel good, especially if they're older athletes, right? Well, it doesn't feel right. It's like, yeah, because it feels different. It feels new. That's what we want. We want to figure out what that feeling is. We have to stay open to it like little kids are, right? They don't think, oh, well, that doesn't feel good. They're just, oh, that feels whatever. That's just how it feels. Okay, so that's an important part of this. And as athletes work into this phase, they develop a higher ability to handle what's called contextual interference. Okay, so we throw these different things at them. Now there's more variables. It's not just them in, say, a one-on-one private coaching session where they're working on the skill and they can totally break down and focus on that skill. It's like, well, now you have all these other things coming into play that are environmental or variations of the drill that increase that interference that test their ability to still perform the skill. Okay, so coaches in this role, like that's a key skill. Like you need to introduce the contextual interference. Okay, especially for things that are like open skills. Okay, so an open skill is just more dynamic, right? Is a good golf skill. Golf is like you got all these closed skills. Tennis, basketball, it's all open. It's very dynamic, different situations. And so you want to help athletes apply the skills that they've acquired, but in different situations. Okay, so you can shoot the jump shot from right here on a basketball court. Now you need to shoot it from this spot over here. Okay, or volleyball. You can make the dig on this side. Now can you make the dig when you're all the way down on the ground? Can you do it diving? Whatever. Okay, so we have more of the sort of demonstration early on, then we shift to more auditory feedback, like feel your way through it. And this is the phase, unlike the cognitive phase that can be pretty short. It's like, well, some athletes will move through that in one session. Okay, associative stage can take months, can take years, depending on the difficulty or the complexity of the skill. It can take a long, long time to develop that. Okay, but once we move through that, so a cognitive stage, the associative stage, we move to the autonomous stage or phase, which is all about, we get to the point where performance execution has been optimized, okay, to where it can occur with relatively little conscious thought, right? It's automatic. So when this happens, we don't have to think about, like in basketball, we're not thinking about dribbling the ball. We can devote more of that mental space to other things that are happening on the court as we're dribbling the ball, right? We don't have to think about what it is we're doing. We can just do it because we've developed that skill. Okay, so in this phase, it might sound like, well, all right, we've made it, we've arrived, but athletes will often get frustrated when they get here because it might seem like their improvement rate slows down. So that can affect their motivation because it's just like, well, okay, you've kind of made it there. You've achieved a certain baseline level of skill or execution. So now it's like, well, you want to keep getting better, but it's like, well, you can only get so good. And so that can be frustrating for some athletes. So coaches and consultants, when athletes are in this stage, the focus is to cultivate motivation. Okay, so you don't need to go in and step in and provide as much feedback as frequently after each performance if you're at a practice and you're coaching them. Okay, so it's more keeping them on task and keeping them motivated toward what their ultimate goals are. Okay, so with that, you have those three learning phases: the cognitive, the associative, the autonomous. And one last idea on this: we don't want to undertake, if we have athletes who get to that autonomous stage, we're in the middle of the season, you don't want to make major technique changes in the middle of the season. You want to wait until the off season to do that, right? You really can throw athletes off. So it's just like, I had this he's this high school track coach, and he always used one of his quips. He was just famous for the quotes. He said, "You got to dance with the girl you brung," right? This is what he said. Like when you get to that point and you're in the season, like you got this skill set, you got to make the most of what you got, because you'll just mess with that athlete in a major way if you try and retool, repackage their swing or whatever skill it is that they're focused on. You got to dance with the girl you brung when you get to the season. Wait to work on those major technical changes in the off season. So with that in mind, I want to now talk about practice design. How do we put this together, right? Coaches are rarely taught how to do this. So many times they'll just kind of, well, let's run some drills, we'll put it together, but how does it fit within an overall master plan? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And if you've ever been to some youth sport practices and you've observed what goes on there, there's just kind of a lot of willy-nilly randomness that's happening. Like, is there a plan here? There's a lot of standing around. What are we doing? And of course, in those instances, a lot of those coaches are just volunteers. They're not trained at all to do that. But that's the majority of youth sport coaches, where kids get their introduction into sport. So this is an important idea, and sports psych consultants can help coaches create better practice plans at all levels, not just the youth levels, all the way up. Like I said at the beginning, I worked with college coaches on this, and they kind of going, oh, wow, like, yeah, I never even thought about that. Okay, but quality practices are the exception. They're not the norm. They're not the norm. Okay, there's a lot of practices where it's going through the motions. There's wasted time. The athletes are not actually working on things that are going to help them get better. Okay, it's just like a lot of routine. I've seen this is the main thing I've seen in college practices. A lot of routine, a lot of things that we do that we're just going through the motion. We're not really spending time at the limits of our abilities. And many times, like, oh yeah, the 2-hour practice, 15 minutes of that was worthwhile. Like, you actually stretched your athletes to help them get better. Okay, so it's this practice design is important, and this is one of the main reasons. Poor practice design is one of the main reasons that some athletes don't value practice. Okay, because they're thinking, well, I don't want to waste so much time practicing things that I can already do, right? And really, the good practices, they're going to maximize athlete motivation. So there's going to be energy. It's going to be fun. It's going to be intrinsically rewarding for what it is, and it's going to maximize skill development. So we should view practice as it's like the most essential factor that influences learning, because that's where all of that comes from. Yeah, we learn when we compete and we play competitions and games and all of that stuff, but practice, like, that's our place. Okay, so here's a final thought on this idea: is practice design or planning, the amount of time that we spend doing that should probably be about the same as our actual practice time. So if I'm going to have a 2-hour practice, which there's some practice philosophies out there that say that's too long for any sport, any situation, like 2 hours, let alone the 3-hour practice. So if we're going to have a 2-hour practice, we should at least spend 2 hours designing that practice. It shouldn't just be throwing different things together. Right now, eventually, coaches get to the point to where they're pretty good at designing a practice in short. They just have that knowledge base that they can pull from, and they want to be able to switch and move in a different direction if they need to. Okay, so it's important to acknowledge that. But the best practices are going to be well thought out and planned, and it should take a good chunk of time if we want that to turn out the way that it will be optimal. So with that, we need to address an important term out there called deliberate practice. Okay, so what is deliberate practice? There's this intentionality about it, is the first thing that I should say, but the type and the quality of the practice is what matters the most, not just the total volume. Okay, so you get this question asked out there all the time, like, how much practice, how much time do you need to spend to become a legitimate competitor in whatever sport it is that you're doing? Okay, how much do you need to spend? So you have that 10,000 hour rule, the 10-year rule, whatever. It actually is a range. It depends on the sport, level of complexity, whatever the thing. If it's music, right, or whatever we're looking at, there's a range. So 4,000 to 10,000 hours, depending on the skill that we're trying to master. And you spend that much time, especially in deliberate practice, which is like this. It has this intense mental concentration combined with high physical effort. That's probably the best way to define it, right? That intensity of the mental focus, and you're working really hard, right? You're on the outskirts of your limits of what your ability is. So you spend 4,000 to 10,000 hours on a particular activity or skill, you're going to get pretty good at it. That's going to lead to some high ability level. Okay, so that's an important thing to understand. So with that, like, practicing longer does not contribute to skill development if the practice doesn't have some of this deliberate practice. Okay, so if it isn't focused, it isn't relevant to closing whatever the performance gaps are. Like I mentioned before, if we're just going through the motions and kind of doing these routine things, I see athletes do this a lot where they go in and they just repeat the same thing over. It's just like, man, just straight blocked practice, just the same skill over and over again. They just want to get it dialed in. They feel like that gives them confidence. I'm like, that's not even hard for you. You can do that all day long. Like, you need to stretch yourself and work on things that are hard for you, that are difficult. Spend time doing that, because that's what's actually going to make you better and help you close performance gaps. Okay, so it's important to understand that. Another term for this is stretch practice. So we want to stretch our abilities. We focus on fixing mistakes. Elite athletes tend to find deliberate practice really enjoyable. Okay, because even though it's hard, even though there's more mistakes, there's not as much success. Like, yeah, that's what I want. I have to work harder for. That's just one of those lessons in life. Anything that comes easy, we don't tend to value as much as things that we had to work really hard for. So elite athletes tend to be more committed to this form of practice. That's right where they're going to go, right to the limits of what it is they can do. I think of top-level basketball players, right, when they're playing horse. Like, they don't shoot the easy shots. They go and they find the most difficult shots that are on the end of what they're able to do, where they might not make it, but they make it. Oh man, then they know they're stretching the next person in line to try and knock down that shot. Okay, so there is a lot of variability in the amount of practice, deliberate practice needed. So I like to use my own experience for this. Okay, different sports, 3-sport collegiate athlete, ran cross country and track, played basketball, played tennis, right? I never really trained for running, was just fast at it. There was some natural giftedness. I didn't put in near as much time for that. I didn't have as much deliberate practice for basketball. I just played basketball. Right? I didn't go and do drills and practice all those things. I did some of that, but I mostly just played pickup games. Just any game I could get, I went and I played with people who were better than me. But I did a lot of deliberate practice for tennis. Spent a lot of time doing drills, trying to hone my skills and improve in those ways. So it's important to understand that the sport, the context, whatever it is, will kind of determine in some way how much time it's going to take there. Okay, so for some coaching tips here, it's better is better, right? Not more is better, better is better. So seek better practice, not more practice. We want to optimize training conditions, which means we need to identify what the appropriate difficulty level is. So I actually worked with an athlete, senior level pickleball athlete this week, who said, well, you just always seem to know what it is that I need. You help just go right outside what I need to work on, and you just hit that over and over and over again, spend that time. Like, yeah, that's intentional, right? That's the deliberate practice idea. We want to find that appropriate level of difficulty, provide good feedback, lots of reps and corrections so they can make those improvements, right? And it's very, very important to close this concept out, that motivation can wane if it's too hard, right? There has to be some amount of success with this. So it's like, well, I mean, maybe 50% of the time they succeed, 50% of the time they don't, because it's that hard. But you don't want to be, well, you only succeed 10% of the time. Like, well, that's not going to be motivating because it's not even close. You made it too difficult. So we want to optimize that difficulty level to make sure that motivation is maintained when we are in a deliberate practice session. All right, so a couple other practice concepts I want to talk about that are important to understand is this, and these, you're getting like just the smallest little slice of this, because there's book chapters written about this. But so we have two ideas for practitioners and coaches to understand. The first is the whole versus part method, and the second is a block versus random practice approach. So whole versus part first. So a whole practice is basically, if we're thinking about a specific skill or some activity, we're working on the whole thing in its entirety. Okay, that's the whole. So I'm going to hit the whole tennis serve, whole motion, right? Whole thing at once. Part practice, we're going to hone in on a particular subcomponent of the skill separately, and then we're going to combine the parts into a whole skill, right? So to the tennis serve example, the whole thing, I'm just going to do, I'll put it all together. Parts, I want to practice the toss. I'm going to practice finding where my grip is, do those independently. I'm going to practice my backswing. I'm going to practice my reach up, right? Or we call it power loop, different things that you can do, contact point, pronation, and follow through on the other end. Then I can add more of the stance or sort of weight transfer from the back foot to the front foot. So there's all these different parts of the serve that I could practice independently, and then, well, we're going to put them all together. You just practice the whole thing. Okay, so there's different ways that you can put together the part practice, right? And there's different times when you would choose the whole practice or the part practice, okay? So the progressive part practice is, well, we're going to work on the parts separately, and then we're going to add them together, right? So then practice the next part separately, and then add that together. So for example, this would be like the tennis serve example is, well, I'm going to practice the toss by itself. I'm going to practice the backswing by itself. Okay, then I'm going to try and put those two together. Then I'm going to add the trophy position, right, or upward swing, right, to contact part, and then I'm going to add that to the other pieces, right? So you add them together, move from one to another progressive part, you build on it. Then you have the repetitive part practice, which is like you practice one and then you add the next one to it. Okay, so progressive part, repetitive part, a little bit different, but then similar in how you put those together. Okay, so when we determine which one to use out of these, right, we have to look at the skill itself. Is it how complex is it? How interdependent is it? So how much does one particular skill before that lead to the next one, or how much does the next one rely on that? Okay, so like the power clean in weightlifting is an example. The movements are, you can break it down and practice those individually, but in a lot of ways, one phase is dependent on the next phase. There's a high level of interdependence. So you can kind of practice those independently, but then how much transfer does that have when you try and put the whole thing together? So we have to consider that. We have to also consider the learner. Like what is their age? What is their biological age? And what is their training age? What skill level do they have? What's their learning style? All of those things. Okay, so we want to use the whole part of the whole practice with simple skills that are highly independent. So I use the power cleaning example, a deadlift, things in weightlifting. Learners can grasp the whole thing, right? Power clean, maybe it's like, well, what are all the things happening here? Okay, so maybe there's more of a justification for that than doing like a deadlift. Okay, but we want to use part practice with complex skills that have separate independent parts. Okay, so again, the power clean here, the ball toss on a tennis serve. If you're going to break down the tennis serve at all, you have like the tossing arm and then the racket arm. Okay, so you can practice that toss without some of the rest of that. Okay, or if it is an interdependent movement and it's hard and they just keep making a particular mistake on one part of it, that can be a good time to do parts practice versus whole practice. Okay, so incredibly brief rundown of those ideas, but we want to have a basic understanding of that. So the next is the block practice versus random practice. So block practice is where we complete a certain number of reps on whatever the particular skill or task is before changing, okay, what it is we're going to work on next. So this just basketball is a prime example with this because they have the shooting gun, right? You shoot and it automatically rebounds, shoots you at the ball, and you catch and you shoot again. So you can set that up. Tennis ball machines do this, baseball pitching machines, all these different things. And you can just have the same ball over and over and over again to practice the same. That's block practice, right? Whereas random practice, we complete the skills in some random order. Okay, so you could kind of set this more up more with some of these things where, okay, the tennis ball machine, one ball is going to give me more spin, one's going to give me more pace. You can change up the kind of spin, so you can try and make that more random where it changes. You don't know what the next one's always going to be. Okay, so the importance in understanding this is there's a time and a place to use either approach. So block practice, generally it leads to faster uptake of new skills. We acquire those skills faster, but we don't have as good of retention over the long term, and we're usually not able to transfer that to novel situations as well. So I talked about before, like, oh, practice player is amazing, and then get into a game. It's like, well, yeah, it's way more dynamic. How do you transfer that to novel situations? It's hard to do that because all you do is spend time in block practice. So random practice is important, where you throw in more of that contextual interference. It just is more random. Like, you don't know what's going to come next. You practice the different skills in a different order. So if you're a swimmer in the pool, you're not going to do the same stroke. Okay, we're here and we're just doing backstroke. That's all we're doing. It's like, well, you can do one lap backstroke, then you're going to do the butterfly, then you're going to do the breaststroke. You switch it up. So it's random. Tends to be better transference, greater or better learning in the long run, even though the initial results aren't as good as blocked practice. Okay, so to summarize this, early on, you have new athletes who are trying to learn things. You want to build their confidence with some success. Use block practice. But as soon as they get a sort of baseline level of skill and that motivation is there, then start adding contextual interference and using more random practice for long-term skill acquisition. All right, shifting now away. We've got our practice design put together. We know what we're going to do, how we're going to set up for deliberate practice, and we're going to have the whole or the parts or blocked or random, those different elements that we consider as we put it together. Now we're in an actual practice. How do we detect errors when we're working with athletes, and what are the types of things that we look for? So this is something, it's always interesting for me to discuss with students or present examples and have them practice it, see the things that they see. Because most of the time, it's students or novice athletes, younger coaches, like, they can see something is going on, but they can't quite pinpoint it because they don't have a system. So that's the first thing I'll open with. When it comes to error detection, you have to have some sort of system to know what it is you're looking for, to break the movement down, or just identify particular elements that you're trying to detect. Okay, so we need to know what correct technique looks like in the first place and the key movement patterns involved. And then with that, we need to know that every movement pattern is going to have some common error points. Okay, so that's what I mean is we can systematize this by recognizing, well, where are the common error points going to come from? Is it going to be in someone's footwork? Is it going to be what they're doing with their body position? Or if they've got an implement, where are they with the implement, right? What components break down the skill? We need to know what that is and how it compares to what optimal is. Okay, so how do we know what caused an error? So there's different components here to look at. So technical reasons, technique concerns, right, are just related to the different biomechanical elements of the skill. So, well, this person's stepping into that movement with the wrong foot. They need to step with the other foot. Or they need to lead with this part of their body first. Like, we need to understand the technical components, and that could be causing the error. That could be causing the mistake. Okay, and this is usually where coaches, this is where their mind goes straight to technique. And it's like, well, yeah, you need to understand that, but it may not always be that. It could be a tactical mistake. So they just made a poor decision, or they didn't read the situation very well because maybe they didn't have that tactical ability there. They're just not making adjustments on. So another ball sports example, maybe they're not making adjustments on a ball that has heavy spin. They're just not reading that and seeing that coming in. So they're measuring the height, the flow of the ball as it's traveling through the air, but they're not adjusting for the spin. Okay, so it's more of a tactical, no, you just made a poor decision there because you didn't adjust to that. But your technique actually was okay for what you were trying to do, just didn't necessarily apply to that situation. So it can be technical, it can be tactical, and it can be physical. So this could just be like deficiencies in fitness. If someone doesn't have the endurance or the strength, their technique's going to suffer. So you don't want to go in and say, well, yeah, you really your form was not where it needed to be here. It's like, yeah, well, but that's not because they had the form. It's a runner. They had the form all the way up until the last race, and then they got wily at the end because they were just tired, right? A fitness component. So it also could be something like, well, there's some asymmetry between their right and left legs and an inability to plant properly on one side. Maybe there's a former injury there that they're compensating for, they're trying to protect. So those are things we have to say, well, what is causing the error here? Is it a lack of technique where my mind tends to go, or is there some physical thing getting in the way? So current example, worked with a player this week who was out on the court and was looking at seeing what was going on, and I was like, it just seems like there's something with I'm trying to pinpoint what it is that's happening. Can't quite pinpoint it, and she admitted, well, yeah, it's actually my hamstring's a little tight, it's knotted up, so I'm just not really stepping with that foot. Like, it looked like there was something going on. I was having a tough time because it didn't seem like it was a technical thing. It was a physical thing. Very important to be aware of that. But it also can be mental things, right? What's their attentional control? Are they concentrating on the right things? Are they paying attention to the most relevant cues? Are they managing their anxiety? We can be easily distracted and have our focus wander if we don't have those mental skills to go along with it. So it can cause those errors in our performance. And again, it may not be related to our technique. And then lastly, it could be external factors. So just the nature of the drill itself is again, for example, if coaches, they tend to do this often. Sometimes I actually do this on purpose. I'll say that up front, is I'll provide a drill that I know is going to be hard and cause a lot of errors just to raise that awareness, and then you bring that back down. So if you go in with that understanding that, okay, this is intentional, stretch and see where we're at, and then back it off to where it needs to be, then that's different. But if you just design this drill and have your athletes go through it and they can't do it, they're making all these mistakes, and you're like, man, why are you making all these mistakes? Yeah, because you designed a crappy drill. Like, it's too hard. Okay, so we need to know that. And then our opponents, right? That can be something that is like an X factor. Well, that's really your execution suffered there just because of something that is outside of your control. Okay, so to the overarching principle with all this, it could be a technical and tactical error, it could be physical and mental, it could be external. When we go about detecting an error, we want to focus on only one at a time, and if it's possible, we want to identify the critical error. So what was the main thing? Because there might be multiple things that we could focus on, but if you're spending a lot of time trying to fix one thing that's really dependent on something that happened previously in the movement, then we're going to keep having the problem. So we have to be able to identify what the critical error is if we want to move them in the optimal direction. Once we've identified the error, we have to provide feedback to help our athlete make the correction on that. So it's one thing to be able to identify it, it's another thing to be able to piece that together with the appropriate feedback that targets the right thing, that's going to be received, is communicated in an effective way to actually result in the change. So it's one of those things we take for granted. We don't think about it that much. Really, really important, this entire process, how it works together. So in order for deliberate practice to be effective, it has to be combined with good feedback. Okay, so there's some key elements we need to consider with this. So the first is the what of the feedback. What is it that we are focusing on? What's the type of feedback? We want it to be, well, it can be either positive feedback, like focusing on the things that went well, or change oriented. So we can focus, we can really break it down into those two categories. A lot of coaches are really good at identifying what went wrong. Okay, and that's usually not all that helpful, especially for more experienced athletes. They know what went wrong. Okay, but a lot of times they'll tell you at the same time, well, I just tell me what I did wrong. I want to know what I did wrong. Okay, but we don't want to get suckered into that. Athletes, even athletes that ask for that. Okay, it's like, this is what you need to do. This is what you did well. This is what you need to do more of. Okay, that sort of language, that's how we want to package our feedback. It's like, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, this was off, that was wrong, right? That's not really super helpful. We're focusing on what we don't want. So we have to figure out how to package it in a way that focuses on what we do want. So give the athletes some positive feedback, what they did well, focus on what they can do better, okay? Because they know the outcome, right? They know what happened. So we don't really need to tell them all the time unless they're more inexperienced athletes, okay? So you have the example, okay, good, you got your serve in. That's an outcome, okay? So there's nothing there. It's like, yes, that's more like you fully extended your hips into that serve, into that movement, okay? So those are things that we can help. So we want to focus on what we want them to do. It will be helpful, okay? So that's the what. So then the how. So many coaches, they actually overcoach during competitions. It's really easy to overload athletes, so we want to actually give them little snippets. Okay, we want to prioritize the piece of feedback that we give them. So there's lots of different ways that we can do this, but the how, we can do it in front of the team. If we're going to do it in front of the team, the tone of voice matters. So it's another experience I had with a college basketball coach. Gave this piece of feedback to an athlete, thought it was positive, thought it was okay, and I watched the athlete and read the body language, and it was really actually the opposite effect. It's more of a demoralizing comment. I talked to the coach about it afterwards and was blown away. Like, oh man, I was way off on that. I completely missed that. Okay, so we can do it in front of the team, choose a tone of voice. We can use it written. It can be video, right? If we use video feedback, we don't want to focus on the errors. We want to focus on the right way to do this. So there's video libraries out there for this that we can use. And then when? So the power of silence is important, right? We don't always have to jump in and give feedback. I had a head coach that I worked for a number of years, many years ago, and had conversations about this because his approach was more step in right away, give the feedback, let them go again. My approach was more guided discovery. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to be quiet, see what they felt, ask for their feedback, and try and guide them along. Because the athletes will know. They'll have some sort of feeling, especially at the higher levels. So it's important. The timing is important, and we have to think about that during competitions as well. So some parting thoughts on this. Our last main thing that we're going to cover in this presentation is we look at basing our feedback on the performance versus the outcome. Okay, so we want to teach our athletes to focus on the performance. It's a key concept in the sports psychology world. So the outcome is always going to be predicated on the performance. And athletes have a lot more control over their performance and what it is they're doing than the outcome. And if we focus on good processes and performances, how we're performing what it is we're doing, that's going to lead to the outcome that we want. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. In review, we covered a lot of different things, the basics of learning. How do we define that relative permanent change, how that applies to athletes, right? Then with that, what are the elements of an optimal practice design? How do we put that together? What are the considerations? We want to make sure that deliberate practice is a part of it. That should be a key term in our vocabulary, how we put it together. Once we have our practice design put together, it's all about detecting errors properly, having a system, knowing what it is that we need to look at, whether that's technical, tactical, physical, mental, or external, those different pieces, and then providing feedback by adhering to those principles of optimal feedback. If we do that, then we're going to promote learning in our athletes in the best possible way and lead to those outcomes that we want. So hope this was helpful for you. Appreciate you listening all the way to the end. Take care. Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.